Welcome everyone to this second meeting of 2022 for the RadicalxChange Swiss chapter. For those who don't know me, I'm Tom. I'm the co-lead of the chapter with Sebastian. Sebastian is also on the call, and apparently poor Sebastian went to the United States last week and caught COVID. He's listening in. We all wish him well. So a few quick things. What I think we wanted to do today, first of all, is a quick recap of the last meetup. I don't know how many people were there. I think most of you probably were, but last meetup we had Glen Weyl, who's the sort of godfather of radical markets and the founder of the RadicalxChange movement, on to talk about some of his ideas and his background, and he talked about some of the main things he's been working on. Talked a bit about RadicalxChange and crypto. We talked about DAOs. We also had a nice presentation about the Hopper DAO. And what we thought we would do today is kind of go deeper into the foundation and deeper into the some of the broader spectrum of the radical exchange ideas, because for those who don't know, there is a whole foundation behind RadicalxChange and behind the movement. And we are very, very pleased to have with us the president of the RadicalxChange Foundation, Matt Prewitt, who's here. And before I introduce, or before I give the stage or give the screen over to Matt, I just want to give you a quick idea of what we're going to do. So I think Matt's going to intro the foundation. We want to get an idea, hopefully, about what the foundation does, its activities, and how we can all get involved. I think we'll get a bit of an overview on some of the main concepts. And then I think, Matt, maybe you wanted to deep dive into one or the other one you had mentioned, so we can do that. And then I'd like to make this pretty much in sort of an interview Q&A kind of format for most of the meeting, which means, I'm happy to lead the conversation in the sense to make sure maybe we can get through all of the topics, but anybody who wants to, who wants to talk, or wants to ask a question or has something to say, just please do. Just there's not that many of us, but maybe if you hit the raise your hand function, that might make it easier, and then we can have this conversation. So with that, with no more further ado, I'd like to say hi to Matt. Maybe you can tell us a bit about yourself. And actually kind of curious, you just got off the call with the Colorado Governor's Office. Maybe you want to tell us a bit about that as well.
Yeah, well, we're working with the state of Colorado on their plans for the future of citizen engagement. So in other words, how can they better use things like civic assemblies and essentially gather richer information from the citizens on how different state projects will affect them and how infrastructure funds ought to be distributed out, and things like that. So that's the sort of broad outlines of the project that we're working with them on, which I'm quite excited about. It's a long-term project, but I'm very hopeful that in the coming months and years, Colorado will roll out some really exciting and ambitious kind of innovative citizen engagement programs. So that's what we're working on with them. But why don't I take a step back and would love to, I will. So I prepared a presentation that kind of goes through some of the basics of quadratic voting and partial common ownership, which I think are sort of in a way, like the foundational ideas for RadicalxChange that have excited me about the potential of this movement and this project, and they continue to, for me to form the basis of a vision for like dramatically better institutions in the future. I think some of you, I know several of you, and so I know several of you are quite familiar with some of these ideas. I think it'll still make sense for me to, go through it a little bit. But before I do, maybe I'll say a word about my own sort of personal history, how I got pulled into RadicalxChange, and what inspired me about this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great. So
okay. All right. So I I'm a lawyer. Before I was doing this, I was a litigator. I worked for a big law firm in San Francisco for a while. I then moved to New York to work for a judge. Working for a judge was really a wonderful experience. It kind of it sort of changed the way that I thought about law. And what I liked about it so much was that I realized that I preferred the role of a judge to the role of an advocate, right? Because when you're a judge, you get to think about what is right. Whereas when you're an advocate, you are only really supposed to think about, which argument serves your client the best. And when I was an advocate, I found myself constantly being distracted by thoughts about what's actually right. So I'm sort of better suited. I realized I was kind of better suited for the judicial role. And anyway, after I left the court, I decided that I wanted to represent clients that I believed in more, basically. And so I became a plaintiff side antitrust lawyer, and I spent a number of years litigating cases, basically against large companies who were violating the antitrust laws. And during that time, I was thinking constantly about this sort of problem of power concentration, about how there are just so many dynamics within society that lead the most powerful companies to just become more and more powerful. And there's so much difficulty in breaking up these kind of multidimensional power concentrations that form in the economy. I became disillusioned eventually about my ability to solve this problem by litigating one antitrust case at a time, because the factors that enable this kind of power concentration to happen are just so complex and systemic, and the antitrust laws really don't fundamentally address them. And so as a consequence of that disillusionment, I began to think more about other ways of creating more lastingly distributed and sort of polycentric and richly textured power structures. And in that context, I became interested in blockchain technology. I started to think a lot about how things that we might build on things like Ethereum might be able to provide like methods for sort of the less powerful parties to coordinate against more powerful parties and sort of even out power distributions in a more lasting way than the antitrust laws seem to be able to accomplish. And as I kind of started to study that, I started to think a lot about incentive design and mechanism design. And so like, what would that actually look like? Like if we were going to build something that would allow less powerful economic players to coordinate, or if we were going to allow lots and lots of people to fund public goods or engage in some kind of mutual aid on a decentralized network, like how would we actually make that work? And I quickly realized that a lot of the idealistic people who were thinking about that and trying to solve for that just didn't have a strong enough understanding of game theory, of mechanism design, of the sort of details of how incentives are going to play out in these radically decentralized power structures. And so that led me to start studying, kind of cutting edge work in mechanism design, which led me to get in touch with Glen Weyl. And Glen and I realized quickly that we were interested very deeply in a lot of the same problems. And I became very, very excited about the potential for a handful of different ideas that were, kind of sketched on some level in the book Radical Markets to become the basis for for better institutions. I'll say, let me say a quick word about that before I kind of jump into like describing, kind of going a little deeper on quadratic voting and partial common ownership. So I think that first of all, let me say that just sort of ideologically and ethically and so on, I have a very, very deep commitment to democracy. I basically believe that figuring out the best way we can to put authority into the hands of the governed is like the only legitimate way for power to be structured. And as a consequence of that, I think that it's really important to think about how to make democracy better. And yet we have this problem. There's kind of a multidimensional problem in when we think about legitimate government, because government needs to change. It needs to evolve in order to work better. At the same time, it can't evolve too quickly. It has to be sort of anchored by tradition, because if you just sort of try to reinvent it like on the spot, then you essentially you create chaos. So there's this kind of like balance between respect for the history of institutions and the sort of optimal structure of how we would design things if we were just redesigning everything on the spot. There's a sort of balance between these two things that needs to be struck, I think, in order to keep democracy like on the rails and vital. And one of the things that there's a sort of a third factor in play here, which is technology. And technological changes, I mean, if we just look at the past 20 years, I mean, I live in California. I've been watching Silicon Valley since the mid 90s. I mean, I've had a long-standing kind of personal and professional kind of relationship with all of the technological stuff happening in California for since the beginning of the internet, basically. And if you look at the consequences that technologies have for government, they change power structures whether anybody likes it or not. So if you look at if you just look at, for example, the way that that social media has affected the functioning of democracy, or the way that the internet has kind of things like the Arab Spring and things like this, you can see basically that technology changes society, but the way that it changes society is sometimes chaotic, and it's uncontrolled, and it doesn't always do what we want it to do, and the way that it interacts with democracy is anything but simple. So, but fast forward to today, I think we've seen lots of sort of failed idealism in Web 1 and Web 2 and the Arab Spring, and I think to me anyway, the story is of naivete and failed idealism, basically. And if we look at it, and I think there's a real danger that we just do that again, that we just have another, we just basically repeat the history from 10 years ago and 20 years ago all over again in the current sort of moment of technological transition. I don't want that to happen. I think it's really, really important that we think more carefully about how to structure the incentives and to basically build a deeper conception of democracy into our digital power structures and into the networks that we're building. We need to do that better than we've done it in the past, and not just not just make exactly the same mistake that people made 10 years ago, basically. And And so to me, the radical exchange is like an attempt to do that, right? In many ways, it's an attempt to do that. We're trying to think about how to deeper conceptions of what democratic decision making might look like, what shared ownership might look like, and build those deeper conceptions into networks, instead of just thinking that technology is going to somehow naturally or magically usher in a more democratic power structure. Okay, so that's kind of how I made my way to this. That's how I see that's why I'm inspired by this work. Maybe I'll pause for a breath there and answer, happy to kind of answer any questions or drill into that. And then, and then if not, and then when done, I'll say, I will drill in a little bit on quadratic voting and on partial common ownership structures that I think are really important, have huge potential, and are important kind of cornerstones for thinking about the future of democracy.
Yeah, Matt, that's brilliant. And I wrote down a whole bunch of, you touched on a lot of things that I think are going to be very interesting to this group. Maybe one thing right now before you go into the other, I see Kenrick has his hand up as well, but just, I personally, also from my work, I'm very interested in these kind of journeys. You told us, your sort of journey into radical markets and RadicalxChange. Do you find very similar ones in the community, or do you find there's different types of people that are drawn to this? Maybe, from idealistic part, maybe from a pragmatic part. I don't know. I'm just very curious, if, because you must meet a lot of people and you're involved deep in the community.
Yeah, I would say that there's quite a lot of diversity in how people kind of make their way to the general, the commitment to the kind of democratic project that RadicalxChange is. I mean, there are, for example, some people probably, I guess I would fall into this category. Some people perhaps come from a more institutional understanding of democracy and are looking for a way of kind of squaring this more traditional institutional understanding of democracy with the dislocations of technology and innovation. And then there are other people who are coming from the other direction, who are maybe in the world of technology and have a background of techno-utopianism or something, and are feeling their way towards a more grounded or more deeply more robust understanding of what democracy means. So there's both of those things and everything in between, and yeah, there's all kinds of paths.
Yeah, I've always felt a lot of our group is maybe on the pragmatic side, a lot of blockchain here and a lot of, doers and makers and stuff. But anyway, I find these stories fascinating. Kenrick, you had a question for Matt?
Yeah, and I guess I maybe just wanted to kind of clarify the context of what you're going to be presenting, because I hear people use the word democracy a lot in a variety of contexts, some of which don't seem, well, so then to me, there's like three contexts that are of interest. One is the public sphere, where certainly in Western society, we, have advocated and striven for democratic principles. But then we've also tended in the private sector to say that that's not run within the organization, that's not a democracy, that it's very much kind of a hierarchy of who owns the private enterprise. And then there now is this emerging kind of third sphere within the cryptocurrency community of these decentralized autonomous organizations, where they're often using terms like decentralized and democracy, but to date, mostly what they've implemented is a corporate model of votes per share, per coin. So is that part of what you plan to address, is like these three different contrasting spheres and what kind of structures are appropriate or how they relate to each other?
I don't know if, I don't think so, but I can say a word about that. I mean, I think that so one piece of background, I mean, at least when I use the word democracy, I understand the word democracy to be so one of my favorite philosophers is a legal philosopher named Ronald Dworkin, and he has this notion, which is very important in my thinking, called interpretive concept. The democracy is an interpretive concept, and so what that means is that it's not fully perfectly defined at any particular point in time, and whenever we're using that word, what we're doing is incorporating basically a moral understanding with a practical, grounded understanding of the facts of the world, and so both of those things are sort of happening at the same time when we think about what democracy means, right? We're squaring it with the facts of really existing power structures that try to be democratic, and with a moral conception of what democracy ought to look like, so it's a little bit of like an ideal that we're trying to push our institutions towards. And then I think, and then the other point is that I mean democracy more broadly than just like nation state democracy, for sure. So democracy, you can understand it as a way that nation states govern themselves or legitimate themselves, but you can also understand it as a decision-making procedure in a small group, or ways of that non-state groups can coordinate with each other. So I think for example, more democracy in private settings, like in the workplace, is something that I believe in. I think we need more democracy in those kinds of traditionally non-democratic settings as well. And I think there's a lot to be gained there.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. All right. Should I jump in?
Yeah. Why don't
Okay.
you take the dive?
All right, cool. All right. I apologize if this may be some of this may be things that you know well, but I want to kind of start from the basics and talk about quadratic voting a bit.
No, that's fine. I think also, there'll be people who might see the video and stuff later. So I think that's helpful.
Great. Okay. So I will talk, I'll go through two ideas here fairly quickly, but trying to assume as little prior knowledge as possible. Quadratic voting and partial common ownership. You can think of quadratic voting as a better way of doing sort of democracy, public decision making. You can think of partial common ownership as a better way of structuring and understanding private asset possession, basically. So what is quadratic voting? Very simply understood, it's a redesigned balloting procedure. It's a redesigned way of allowing a group of people to make a collective decision through a vote. So if you can imagine a ballot, you may have a range of different issues on the ballot that the group is deciding on. So you may be voting for a president, you may be voting for a representative, you may be voting on more local issues, maybe voting on less local issues. You can decide on many different issues in the same ballot. And then some of these issues, you may well, the way that a normal ballot works is that, essentially everybody's got, one vote, which they can use on each of the issues that's being decided on the ballot. Quadratic voting is just a little bit of a twist on that, where instead of everybody just getting one vote where they can sort of go up or down or sideways on each particular issue, everyone's got an equal budget of voice credits, which they can allocate between the different issues however they want, representing how strongly they care about the different issues. So this allows you to sort of express the idea that some of the things that the group is deciding are more important to you than other things that the group is deciding. The twist, the sort of innovative, clever thing that quadratic voting does, it makes it different from other sorts of, kind of allocating voice credits type approaches, is that there's a quadratically increasing price to expressing yourself more loudly on a particular issue. So the way that it works is that on every particular issue on the ballot, if you want to have one counted vote on that issue, then you allocate one voice credit to it. If you want to have 2 votes on the issue, you have to allocate 4 voice credits to it. If you want to have 3 votes on an issue, then you have to allocate 9 voice credits to it, etc. So what this means is that you can, if you want to, you can vote more loudly. You can express a stronger opinion on a particular issue, but there's a steep and increasing price to doing that. So if you decide that you want to have a very loud voice on a particular issue, that means you're going to have a much quieter voice on all of the other issues. What this does is it allows the group to get basically richer information about how much everybody cares about all the different issues, and through the voting process come to like more nuanced, complex compromises between all of the things that all of the options and decisions that the group is collectively taking. I'll say one important kind of thing to understand about what's going on with that quadratic pricing is it's kind of the way to understand what it's doing is that it's essentially creating an incentive for all of the voters to honestly disclose how strongly they care about a particular issue. So if you didn't have that quadratic pricing, what would end up happening is that the loudest voices in the room would end up deciding each of the issues. In other words, on issue 1, some people might sort of push all of their credits into that one. And on issue 2, other people might push all of their credits into that one. And without that quadratic pricing, those people who care very, very strongly are going to end up sort of winning each issue, which would mean that like the most extreme voices would be prevailing on every single thing. Whereas in quadratic voting, we're allowing people to express themselves more strongly. So we're avoiding the other kind of problem, which is this sort of tyranny of the majority. But we're incentivizing people very strongly to only express yourself strongly if you really, really feel strongly. Because if you do that, what you're doing is you're sort of ceding power to the rest of the group on all of the other issues. So one illustration of the kind of thing that quadratic voting can do, the kind of like benefit that it has, is you can just imagine a situation where we're voting between, it's a stupid example, but just you can imagine a situation where we're voting between cats and dogs. 45% of people prefer cats, 45% of people prefer dogs. in a normal voting situation, what would happen is that the 10% of people in the middle who really just don't care, who just don't have a strong preference between cats and dogs, will end up flipping out a coin or just seeing how they feel that way that day or whatever. And those 10% of indifferent people end up deciding for everyone. That's a pretty bad outcome. That's the kind of bad outcome that kind of has a way of shaking people's faith in democracy and making people wonder whether democracy really works or is really such a great way of making decisions. And quadratic voting can help address it, because what it does is it captures information not only about whether people prefer cats or dogs, but how strongly they prefer cats or dogs. So if it might be the case that cat people just barely prefer cats to dogs. They don't really, on average, cat people just don't care that much. They just slightly prefer cats. But on average, dog people feel super strongly and really, really prefer dogs. And so if that's the case, then we want the vote to be able to capture that information and represent that the group overall prefers dogs to cats without letting these indifferent people in the middle carry the issue. So just some of the advantages that quadratic voting has, or it allows voters to express these nuances of preference. It fights polarization. It helps a group find complex compromises. It avoids the situation where apathetic voters are swinging outcomes. It also avoids this sort of tyranny of the majority problem, where 51% wins, 51% controls the outcome for everybody, even though it might be that 49% feels much more strongly about the issue than the 51%. And it essentially creates it captures more information from voters than traditional voting. We have used quadratic voting now in lots of different settings with activist groups, with governments, with city councils. One of the most prominent places where we've been using it now since 2019 is in the Democratic caucuses of the Colorado State House and Senate. The legislators use quadratic voting to prioritize appropriations bills, and so in order to basically, they use it to get a rich representation of how strongly the members of the caucus feel about different spending bills that they need to sort of weigh and prioritize in order to decide which bills to put forward onto the floor to vote. Why don't I pause there before I go before I switch over to partial common ownership, talk about that. Would love to drill in on this. Any thoughts or questions?
Yeah, Matt, maybe two quick things. One, I've been asked by people about quadratic voting when I explain it, if it's not really better suited to situations when there's more than just two options. That's the one question. The other thing I want to mention is I'm a bit looking at time. We got 20 minutes left in the hour, but maybe that could be one quick question to address. I'd love to hear the partial common ownership stuff.
Sure. Yeah. The answer is that yes, quadratic voting does work better in situations with more than two options, because it lets these sort of complex opportunities for compromise come through. So the example with cats and dogs is basically an example to illustrate the insight in a very simple way, but it's quadratic voting really shines when you have more options, more people, more sort of complex compromises that are possible, so that information about how strongly people feel can be kind of synthesized.
Cool.
All right, so why don't I jump over to partial common ownership? So partial common ownership is an old idea. The form of partial common ownership that I'm going to talk about is kind of inspired by the writing and thinking of a 19th century American economist named Henry George. Henry George was a land reformer, basically. He had essentially an insight about why poverty persists in even in cities and places that are rapidly developing and where lots of wealth is being created. Interestingly enough, in the 1870s, he lived in San Francisco, which was at that time a booming, developing but still rather small town. And there was a ton of wealth being created in San Francisco, and yet there was still a ton of poverty and misery. And Henry George sort of wondered why this was, and what he realized was that even as the prospects for the city got better and better, even as more and more wealth was being created, what was happening is that those prospects for wealth creation were driving up the prices of land in and around San Francisco. And so therefore, the people who didn't have capital, didn't have access to capital in the city, were being charged higher and higher rents for the privilege of living and working in the area. So in other words, even as prosperity increased, rent increased, basically, right alongside that prosperity, and therefore kept people who were not landowners in the same situation that they were in before, or even made their lives more difficult. Here's the kind of Georgist insight, essentially, is that the rents from land ought to be taxed away and redistributed. So kind of a great sort of illustration of the Georgist insight is if you imagine like a vacant lot. So in other words, if you purchase a vacant lot in a developing city, and just hold on to it for 10 years, and just sort of rope it off and keep everybody off of it, hold on to it for 10 years or something, that might end up being a great investment. The value of that vacant lot might actually increase. But the owner of the vacant lot actually hasn't done anything productive at all, right? In fact, they've just sort of wasted the potential for that land to benefit somebody, because they haven't invested in it, right? They literally just haven't done anything with it. So why has it increased in value, right? The reason why the vacant lot has increased in value owes nothing to the investment or to the labor of the owner. It has increased in value because other people nearby that vacant land have engaged in commerce and culture and economic development, thus making that vacant land more valuable for its proximity. So in other words, the kind of, if we sort of make a distinction between the value of like structures that are built on land, and the value of the land itself, you can see that, the value of structures, the value of investment in land, owes something to the investments and the labor and the commitment of owners. But the value of the land underneath it, really doesn't, right? The value of land itself is created not by the people who own it, but by the community in general. And Henry George's proposed solution to this was what he called a land value tax, where basically the idea would be to try to calculate the rental value of land and the rental value of undeveloped land, basically, and tax and redistribute that that quantity. There's a lot of sort of interesting things about this proposal, but it's also kind of it's difficult to implement for all kinds of reasons. One of which is that it's a little bit hard to estimate, a little bit hard to understand the value of land without the structures on it, especially in sort of developed areas. So one of the but there might be interesting ways of essentially solving this problem and of getting more accurate estimates of the value of land and the extent to which the value of land is being created by a community. In the 1970s, there was an economist named Arnold Harberger who had an interesting idea, sometimes called Harberger taxation. What that is the idea that when you hold an asset, you have to self-assess the value of the asset. So I say, what my land is worth to me, and then I communicate that to the public. And then I have to pay a property tax on that self-assessed value. Now, the catch is that the self-assessed value, which I'm reporting to the public, is also a sell offer. So anyone who wants to come to me and buy the buy the land for that self-assessed value, I have to accept it. I have to make that transaction. There's another bit of interesting game theory here in the sort of RadicalxChange version of this mechanism, involving something called the turnover rate. So the turnover rate is the probability that a piece of land, and I'm talking about land here, but we could imagine this in the context of any different asset. We could imagine it in the context of a stake in a digital network or whatever. But for ease of metaphor, I'll continue to talk about land. We can imagine that for every particular asset, we calculate the odds that someone else will buy it in the next period of time X, so in the next year or something like that. And so you can imagine if there's a 10% chance that someone else will buy my land from me in the next year, then that's a 10% turnover rate. And if we set the tax rate at that turnover rate, what that does is it balances incentives in an interesting way, so that there is no incentive for me to dishonestly over-report the value of the land to me, and no incentive for me to dishonestly under-report the value of the land for me. Because if I over-report the value of the land, if I say that it's worth more to me than it is actually worth to me, in order to try, in other words, to try to prevent someone else from buying it, then I'm going to have to pay a tax on that value, meaning that my over-reporting will have an expected value of 0. Similarly, if I under-report the value of the land to me to try to reduce my tax bill, I correspondingly increase the chances that someone will buy it from me, which again means that my expected value to me of that under-reporting are 0. So in other words, if we hold assets according to this system, where we have to constantly report what we would be willing to sell them for, and pay a tax at the turnover rate calculated against that self-assessed value. What that means is that the incentives will align so that everyone will be honestly reporting what things are worth to them, which means that assets will naturally flow to their most efficient owners. And at the same time, so there's like a great economic efficiency, thing happening here. And at the same time, the basically the negative externalities of my asset possession, the cost that I'm imposing on the community by being the sole possessor of this asset, are essentially very, very precisely calculated in the form of this tax, which I'm then paying, and which can then be redistributed to the community, sort of compensate everyone for the the downside of private ownership. So so this is that's Harberger taxes, or sometimes we call it SALSA, which stands for self-assessed licenses sold at auction, but it's essentially more or less the same idea. And that's the basic idea there. This chart shows is a kind of a good visual representation of how to think about the relationship between this mechanism and economic efficiency. So if you think of, for the reasons that I just described, if you set the tax rate at the turnover rate, the assets will flow to their most efficient owner, which means that you'll have sort of a maximum level of what you might call allocative efficiency. So in other words, making sure that assets are possessed by the people who can put them to the highest and best use. So that's represented by this red line here, right? And you can see that at the at its maximum point, that would be what that represents, the sort of tax being set at the turnover rate. Now, if the tax is set at 0 for this kind of asset, the way to think about that is that is exactly the same as private ownership. Because if there's no tax on the asset at all, then I can then whatever I own, I can essentially self-assess its value at infinity, which means that nobody can buy anything. Nobody can buy the asset from me unless I want them to. It's exactly the same as just an absolute private ownership right. So that's what's going on if the tax rate is at 0. Now, in the case of perfect private ownership, a different kind of efficiency is maximized, and we can call that investment efficiency. What's meant by investment efficiency is the idea that if I own a piece of land and I build something on it, we want to encourage that. We want to encourage people to develop land. We want to encourage people to invest in their assets. And if you are the sole, complete, absolute owner of an asset and you invest in it, you're ensuring that all of the future gains from that investment go to you. So that's 100% investment efficiency. Right now, investment efficiency, as we start to increase the tax rate on a self-assessed asset of this kind, the investment efficiency will begin to decline. First slowly and then more quickly. And so by sort of taking the average of these two kinds of efficiency, right, where the allocative efficiency is maximized with a tax turnover rate and investment efficiency is maximized with a tax of 0, you see that the average of these two quantities, which is represented by the perfect line, reaches a maximum somewhere between them. So in other words, the optimum, in other words, setting a tax on a Harberger tax style asset somewhere between 0 and the turnover rate is going to result in maximum efficiency. And because of this allocative efficiency sort of argument, we can see that absolute traditional private ownership is never going to be the most efficient way of managing an asset economically. So there's always going to be, even if sometimes we might want the Harberger tax rate to be quite low, we're always going to want to structure assets in this way, as opposed to traditional private ownership, in order to maximize economic efficiency on the one hand, and also to maximize the sort of fairness and ability to redistribute gains in asset values on the other hand. So this idea is a big one. I mean, the idea that we can kind of rethink private ownership and come up with a more efficient and more fair way of structuring asset ownership. I mean, I probably don't need to sort of explain why that might be a big idea. And so there's a lot of interesting work going on right now in integrating this asset structure into new things. So, for example, we're working with a real estate developer in Maine who's building a mixed-use real estate project in which the rights to occupy different parts of the real estate project are going to be managed pursuant to Salsa rights. There's different sort of variations on how the Salsa rights can work in order to make it workable, in order to make it predictable, in order to make the possession feel comfortable, feel similar to like a traditional lease to people who are occupying it. But this economic structure is a powerful thing that can make the community more efficient, make the assets fairer and more efficient. Similarly, we can build this kind of thing into digital assets. So like non-fungible tokens, which are now, as I'm sure you're all aware, taking over the world in various bizarre ways. We can, Harberger taxed NFTs are a better way of doing NFTs than regular NFTs. And as we use more sort of like blockchain representations of private ownership, like NFTs, to represent ownership of real world things, well, if we can get Harberger tax NFTs, or partial common ownership NFTs, to kind of make it into the public consciousness, then we can open the door for this better system of ownership to go mainstream and to cover lots of different kinds of scarce assets that in the real economy. Similarly, there's really interesting applications of this in like DAO governance, which I've written about. So yeah, I'm on the hour. I apologize for talking too long, but if anyone, I can stay on. So if anyone would like to talk a little bit longer, I'm around.
Yeah, great. No, I just wanted to jump in and say, yes, I'm happy to continue as well. I can go to 7:30 myself until the guests arrive. Then I'll probably have to go. So here's some questions in the chat I just saw because I was on the other thing. Ryan, you want to go into your question and then Guy?
Sure. You kind of touched on this a little bit. And I think this is one of the big questions of Salsa is how the turnover rate's determined, and also what its scope, and what have the conversations that you've been seeing have been having. What are people thinking for that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, one of the well, okay. So one of the most important things in order to build make sure that turnover rate isn't like manipulable, isn't sort of like an attackable variable. So what that means is that you want the turnover rate for any particular asset to be set by a set based on a large enough data set that manipulation of any particular asset isn't going to be able to influence the turnover rate on that asset. So in other words, like we want to, if we were looking at if we were trying to calculate the turnover rate for, you know, a parking lot in Maine or something like that, what we would want to do is we want to have a large rich set of data about similar assets and set the turnover rate based on that data. So it's important basically that it be done by in a rational way with a large data set by some kind of in some sort of a good faith way, basically, right? So I mean, for sure, like if the turnover rate is set naively, or if it's set by some party that can be manipulated, then you've got a problem. But I think that there are I think that, I mean, the way that I think about this is that coming up with some sort of like oracle or something like that can set turnover rates for a bunch of different assets using big data sets is it's a solvable problem. It's a way of sort of simplifying the what is today kind of a big messy problem of how to structure assets and tax rates. So yeah, I mean, long story short is I think it's a problem you want to solve with technology. You want to get as much data as you can. You want to crunch the numbers in a good faith way to get to the best honest estimate of what the turnover rate ought to be. But then if you can do that, then you know you've got a super efficient asset structure. So I've been thinking a little bit about like what like a democratically governed oracle for turnover rates might look like that could plug into smart contracts. Yeah, anyway, it's a longer conversation, but that's the beginning of my answer.
Well, like you said, it is a solvable problem. It's just we just got to solve it.
Yeah, well, it's a solvable problem, but I don't think it's ever perfectly solved, because the thing to understand about turnover rate is that it's actually a prediction about the future. Mm-hmm. So it's semi unsolvable in the sense that we don't know the future. Mm-hmm. But what we can do is get to our best possible good faith estimates about the probability of the asset turning over in the future.
As long as the collective community accepts that, then right. Then it's solved, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
Guy, did you want to ask your question? I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, but I'm very interested in. I had the same question.
Yeah, so you can go ahead and ask it. It's okay.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a simple question. Have any of these models been tried and tested at scale?
Yeah, well, I think probably the biggest at scale use of quadratic voting at this point is Gitcoin grants program, which is using quadratic funding, which is kind of a variation on quadratic voting to fund to basically create a public goods style funding facility for open source software projects and other kinds of public goods that the Gitcoin community is trying to support. Gitcoin is, so I mean, some of the, for example, the, I mean, we can talk about, I think there's slightly different conversations to be had about the worries you might have with quadratic funding or quadratic voting and partial common ownership at scale. But Gitcoin is using using an algorithm to try to identify abuse and collusion in the quadratic funding ecosystem that seems to be working quite well in identifying the worst and most worrisome cases of collusion in trying to extract funds through quadratic funding, so in other words, there's more work to be done in terms of getting the scale up, but we're definitely we're above the level of just small groups. I mean, we're in Gitcoin, there's millions of dollars flowing through this facility and many thousands of people interacting with it, and it's working so far without major failures. So scaling is a challenge. I mean, you're right. It's not like there aren't problems to be solved there. There are, but I think that the project of building towards higher scales, building towards more robust systems is worth doing, and we're that's what we're working on, and we're supporting that kind of work.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Matt. That was very interesting. I was curious on the Harberger thing, but maybe I don't want to be cheeky, but is there a problem there if I'm if I'm an owner, right, and I'm feeling a bit taking some risk? Couldn't I self-assess really, really high as a kind of a way to advertise my property, and say, somebody else say, hey, if he thinks it's worth that much, I better get it.
Yeah, I don't see a problem there. I mean, if you want to self-assess it really high, then your tax bill will go up. So whatever you do, it's kind of either it's captured in your tax bill or it's captured in your risk of losing the property. So I think it's robust to that.
Okay. All right. Listen, I was wondering if because I really have to go in 20 minutes, but I was wondering maybe if you had some time to I was hoping we could maybe talk a bit about the foundation, maybe, show some of your activities and talk about how people can get involved. And there's a bit of a discussion in the chat about tooling, and maybe we can take a look at RadicalxChange Voice, if that would work out.
Sure. Yeah. So the RadicalxChange Foundation is we're a nonprofit based in the United States. We're small. There's 5 of us. We do consulting projects around the world, implementing these decision technologies and these sort of partial common ownership technologies with governments and with groups that are interested in integrating them and developing them. We also build our own tools that sort of instantiate our thinking about how to best sort of build structures and processes around things like quadratic voting. We do and then the other sort of part of our work is organizing conferences and essentially supporting a network of people around the world who are interested in learning more about this and who are working on projects that advance this kind of work, either creatively or through academic research, or in organizations and in building technology. So those are the sorts of categories of the work. In terms of how to get involved, one great way of getting involved, I think, is participating in working groups. So we have a couple different working groups going at the moment. One of them is focused on the problem of one of them is essentially a group of a bunch of entrepreneurs and blockchain professionals who are thinking about building partial common ownership NFTs, coalescing around a standard way of doing that, or a library of different kind of tweakable versions of partial common ownership NFTs, thinking about how to get those integrated into platforms where NFT transactions are going on. So that's one work group. Another working group we have is what we call the Data Freedom Act group, where we've been essentially coordinating on sharing information about data policy, sharing ideas, and collaborating on different projects around data policy and data governance now since 2019. Data, sort of collective ownership of data and governance of data is another sort of major area of work that a lot of what I have been talking about applies to, and in which we've been deeply engaged. Coming soon, we are going to be starting up a working group on local governance, basically on different ways of applying quadratic voting, quadratic funding, partial common ownership in the context of like municipal governance or city governance. So these are a couple ways of getting involved. If any of you are interested in engaging more deeply in any of those things, reach out to me. There's also the Discord server, which some of you are probably already aware of, which is a great place to meet other people around the world thinking about this stuff, and have deeper conversations and strike up collaborations about it. And yeah, chapters. You should. I think things like this are a great way to kind of learn more, go deeper on the possibilities here, pull other folks interested in next kind of the future of democracy into the conversation, and would love to support in any way we can that kind of community work. So
how can people best get in touch with you?
Probably the best way to get in touch with me is by email.
Yeah.
Matt@RadicalxChange.org. Or you can, on the Discord server, you can shoot me a message. I'm at Matt P there. Yeah, always happy to talk. And as you can tell, I mean, this is I believe in this stuff to my core. I basically think that using basically incorporating better ways of democratic decision making and asset ownership into the next generation of institutions and technological platforms, it couldn't possibly be more important. We need to get better at this stuff in order to solve the existential threats that society faces. We need to get better at collaborating, solving problems together, sharing scarce assets, and forming shared goals. And I believe that the work RadicalxChange is doing is a valuable contribution to that critical project. So, you know, at your service, and hope to get to know you all a little bit better and work together.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That's fantastic. I don't know, does anybody have any final questions for Matt? If you can raise your hand or just jump in.
Just wanted to thank you. It was very interesting discussion. I'm looking forward to continue learning and maybe chatting in other opportunities. So thank you for your time.
Terrific. Yeah, thank you.
All right, great. So maybe in the last couple of minutes, I just wanted to say a few words about what's going to happen next with the chapter, and the words will be few because I'm still not quite sure. But Sebastian and I are dedicated to trying to do a meetup like this one per month. Hopefully, now that the restrictions in Switzerland have been lifted for COVID, we maybe go to in-person or a hybrid event type of thing. And I don't know, is Ryan still on the call? Yeah. Yep. So I just want to have a quick chat. So Ryan, for those who don't know, Ryan Miller, who was speaking before, he's the lead of the San Francisco chapter. And we had a chat. I'm very keen on finding ways to make some of these meetups a little bit more interactive. So not just, it's great to have speakers and great to talk about ideas, but maybe find ways to do some, some game type stuff, to do some quadratic voting testing, to do some maybe something on the salsa. And I think, Ryan, you've been playing around with some of these things as well on your end, right? Maybe we can, shoot out some of those ideas we were talking about.
Yeah, one of the big ones is how do we, maximize participation and generate the discussions that will lead to, fruitful relationships and pursuits and opportunities out there. And, we have done, I think, 3 in-person meetings, which is tough with the restrictions, but I mean, I'm not a big fan of staring at a computer screen. So I'm more of an in-person person. That I think is a driver behind that. But we realize in order to, again, get the maximum participation, we got to figure out ways of again, maximizing the ability to participate. So we had discussed, potential, and this is something too, I'm just building out the, an email list. We've been doing a lot of on Twitter and Discord, throwing things out there, but building an email list to solicit ideas from our local members that have expressed interest. But we were thinking, and we were discussing this time about doing something where we do a hybrid model where someone just like Matt did, brief presentation, and then we can have because it's very difficult to coordinate the conversations in person with the conversations online. So figuring out something to moderate, and then have some kind of activity where, you can actually separate those 2 groups. They do something, come back together. And then you have a discussion at the end of, maybe collectively solving some kind of problem related to one of the concepts. Actually going to take a step back, I was thinking, Matt, to send out a, maybe even do a voice to see what people want to do and how people want to respond as like an initial, way of getting people involved with some of the concepts, to do a voice vote. How do we want to conduct this local chapter? And then, maybe throw out some of these ideas to them to get people thinking. And we would love to do some inter-chapter work. I know, it's a little bit of a time difference, but clearly we're able to make it work. If there's some kind of inter-chapter activities to also start, because we are a global society, is a global movement, to start, building those ties that are already existing on places like Discord, but to get more actual voice, human face dialogue going on.
Yeah, I would also add that I think that maybe even you doing a voice process in a chapter meeting might be a fun kind of interactive thing to do, and a good way to just kind of start getting our hands dirty and thinking about how to use these tools.
Yeah, I was interested to see how the budget is determined, like for the voting.
Yeah,
but we can go deeper in.
I mean, I would just say, you know, and I'm working with Matt RadicalxChange actually to use the voice process. We're using RxC Voice and quadratic voting to build a citizens ballot proposition in a very challenging kind of challenging environment out here, well, for the challenging problem out here in California. Where the heck was I going? Sorry, totally lost my train of thought there. What you were, so then the number of voice cards, I think that's just something that, you know, is determined by the breadth and scope of, you know, whatever you're looking at. So, you know, if where 99 seemed to be the nice magic number, that the default number, 99 or 100, you know, something like that, that's how I would probably, you know, that kind of number for a local chapter, because you're going to have, it depends on how many people are participating, how much voice you want to give folks. That's kind of something that I think you have to figure out case by case basis. But yeah, I think it's a good idea. Maybe that you know, at least Matt for the Bay Area, maybe that is the next. Maybe we do the next one online and use that process to actually start to build. And each chapter maybe can, you know, we can set the examples for other chapters. Maybe we could do in Switzerland as, you know, to determine each chapter again in the spirit too of plurality, you know, of chapters to see what people locally want to do. You know, how much do they want to get together? How much they want? What kind of things do they want to see? What kind of relationships and discussions do they want to have?
Yeah, I think I mean, I'm still keen. I know that it's not going to be easy. I understand that, but I'm keen on trying some hybrid things just to see, because what I really like about what's happening now is the fact that we've got a lot of people from outside Switzerland here as well. Got you here. You know, Matt can come in and that's a nice element as well. So with that in mind, I'm afraid I'm going to have to slowly but surely get on to the rest of my evening. But, you know, if anybody here has any ideas also for the Swiss chapter and for the meetup, you can reach me through the meetup chat on meetup.com through the channel there, or you can, I put my email in the chat here. It's lionstom01 at Gmail, and we can get in touch. But I think, yeah, it'd be nice to do something more interactive for the next one. All right, and if nobody else has anything else, then I just really want to thank you, Matt, for taking the time and for supporting us so far.
Absolutely.
Great.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Stay safe, everyone. Yeah.
Stay safe, everyone. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, Jörg.
Bye.
Thank you.